Have you ever thought about why it feels fundamentally wrong to kick a dog, but completely fine to smash a broken toaster with a hammer? I mean, on the surface, they are both just physical objects interacting with the world, but our ethical intuition screams that one matters and the other doesn't. We often vaguely point to the idea that the dog can feel pain. But today, we are going to get much more precise about this. We are diving into a really fascinating paper by Andrew Y. Lee titled Consciousness Makes Things Matter, published in Philosophers' Imprint. It's a rigorous philosophical exploration of exactly why and how consciousness is the bedrock of ethical standing. So, to kick things off, Lee starts by clarifying what we are actually arguing about when we talk about welfare. He splits the foundation of welfare theory into two distinct questions, which I think is a brilliant way to untangle a lot of messy ethical debates.
It really is a great starting point, and it's essential for understanding his whole argument. Lee points out that when philosophers talk about welfare, they're usually trying to figure out what makes someone's life go better or worse. But that actually conflates two different things. So step 1 inch, his framework is separating these two questions. Question A is about the welfare good. A welfare good is whatever it is that makes an entity intrinsically better off. So, is it pleasure? Is it having your desires fulfilled? Is it acquiring knowledge? That is a huge debate in itself. But question B, which is what Lee focuses on, is entirely different. It asks what kind of entity can be better or worse off in the first place. This is the concept of the welfare subject. A welfare subject is simply an entity that has a welfare level, an entity for which things can go well or badly. Lee's paper isn't trying to tell us what the welfare goods are. Instead, he is laser-focused on what makes something a welfare subject, and his answer is what he calls the phenomenal theory of welfare subjects.
Right, so we are putting aside the debate about whether eating chocolate or reading poetry makes a life good. And we are just looking at who or what is even capable of having a life that goes well or poorly. And that brings us to the core claim of the paper, the phenomenal theory of welfare subjects. But Lee is very specific about which version of this theory he is defending. He defends the capacity version. Can you unpack what that means and how it differs from other ways we might think about consciousness and welfare?
Absolutely. The phenomenal theory, at its most basic, says that consciousness is what makes an entity a welfare subject. But we have to be careful here. If we use the state version of this theory, it would mean an entity is only a welfare subject when it is actively in a conscious state. That would mean when you are in a deep, dreamless sleep or under general anesthesia, you temporarily cease to be a welfare subject. That is a pretty radical and counterintuitive view. So Lee defends the capacity version. The capacity version of the phenomenal theory of welfare subjects states that an entity is a welfare subject if and only if it has the potential or the capacity for phenomenal consciousness. This means that even if you are knocked out cold, as long as your brain retains the underlying structural capacity to generate subjective experience, you still possess a welfare level. You are still a welfare subject. It is the capacity for there to be something, it is like to be you, that grants you this status.
That distinction makes a lot of sense, and it avoids the weird implication that we lose our moral standing every time we take a nap. So now that we have the theory defined, let's look at why we should believe it. Lee offers both intuitive motivations and theoretical motivations. Let's start with the intuitive side. What are the everyday ethical judgments or thought experiments that push us toward accepting that the capacity for consciousness is the exact boundary of welfare subjecthood?
One of the strongest intuitive motivations Lee points to is our intuition about death. When a person dies, what fundamentally happens from an ethical perspective? They permanently lose the capacity for consciousness, and intuitively we believe they stop being a welfare subject at that exact moment. They no longer have a welfare level that is actively fluctuating. Another huge intuitive motivation is what Lee calls predictive success. If you look at the boundary lines of our fiercest ethical debates, they perfectly track the boundary lines of the debate about consciousness. Think about the ethical status of animals versus plants, or patients in a persistent vegetative state, or early-stage embryos, or even highly advanced artificial intelligence. In every single one of these cases, the moment we suspect there might be a spark of subjective experience, our ethical alarms start ringing. The phenomenal theory perfectly explains why this happens.
Exactly. The moment someone says an AI might actually feel something, the conversation shifts from property rights to moral rights. That predictive success is a very compelling point. But Lee doesn't just rely on gut feelings. He also has strong theoretical motivations for adopting this view. He wants to preserve the theoretical role of welfare itself. He uses this great example about asking if a life is worth living. How does that theoretical angle solidify his argument?
It is about making sure our concepts actually do the work they are supposed to do in philosophy. The concept of welfare is meant to help us evaluate how things are going for an individual. Lee points out that the question, is X's life worth living, is a fundamental question in welfare theory. But that question is literally nonsensical if you apply it to a house, or a corporation, or a toaster. Those things don't have a perspective, so they don't have a life to evaluate. Furthermore, Lee argues for a unified substrate. We don't want a messy, disjunctive theory that says an entity is a welfare subject if it is a human, or a dog, or something with a complex nervous system, or something that is self-aware. That is too fragmented. The phenomenal theory provides a single, elegant property, the capacity for consciousness, that neatly unifies all the disparate things we consider to be welfare subjects. It ensures that welfare is always relative to a subject's perspective.
I love that theoretical cleanliness. It just cuts through the noise. But now the paper takes a very rigorous dialectical turn, and this is where it gets a bit dense, so we need to walk through it carefully. Lee wants to prove that his phenomenal theory of welfare subjects is logically independent from our theories about welfare goods. This means he has to prove it from two directions. First, he has to show that if you are an empiricist, meaning you think all welfare goods are experiential, like pleasure, that doesn't automatically mean you get his theory for free. How does he prove that empiricism doesn't just entail the phenomenal theory?
This is a crucial step in the paper. To prove this logical independence, Lee introduces a thought experiment involving an entity we'll call zero. Imagine an entity that is phenomenally conscious, it has subjective experiences, but because of some weird biological or psychological wiring, it is completely incapable of accumulating any welfare goods or bads. No matter what happens to it, its welfare level remains statically at zero. If you combine strict empiricism with the standard analysis of what a welfare subject is, you actually run into a problem here. The standard analysis often assumes a subject must be capable of having its welfare go up or down, but zero's welfare never moves. So standard empiricism might look at zero and say, well, it can't accumulate goods, so it's not a welfare subject. But under Lee's phenomenal theory, zero is undeniably a welfare subject because it has the capacity for consciousness. Lee notes that to make empiricism compatible with zero being a welfare subject, you'd have to adopt something like van der Deijl's welfare neutrality framework, which changes the whole analysis. Therefore, just being an empiricist about goods isn't enough to magically give you the phenomenal theory of subjects. The two theories are logically distinct.
That is a brilliant thought experiment. It separates the capacity to have a score from the ability to score points, so that covers the first direction. The second direction is showing that anti-empiricists, people who think welfare goods, include things outside of our conscious experience, like having your desires satisfied, even if you don't know it, that these people don't automatically refute the phenomenal theory. How does Lee show that an anti-empiricist can still logically accept that consciousness is the boundary of welfare subjects?
He uses a fantastic analogy from physics to explain this. Imagine you are a desire satisfaction theorist. You think a welfare good is just getting what you want, regardless of how it feels. And let's say you also hold a functionalist view of desires, meaning a desire is just a behavioral disposition, not necessarily a conscious feeling. An opponent might say, aha, if desires don't require consciousness and fulfilling desires is the only welfare good, then you can have a non-conscious welfare subject. But Lee says no. That is a logical leap. You can consistently hold that desires don't require consciousness, but still insist that only conscious beings are the types of entities whose desires actually matter for welfare. Here is the analogy. Think about mass and weight. An object's weight is determined by gravity, but its mass is an intrinsic property. If you take a bowling ball into deep space where there is no gravity, its weight is zero, but it still has mass. It is still the kind of thing that could have weight if the conditions were right. Similarly, a conscious subject might not have any desires currently being satisfied, so they might not have any welfare goods at the moment, but their capacity for consciousness acts like mass. It is the fundamental property that makes them the kind of entity capable of bearing welfare, even if their current welfare level, their weight, is zero. So, an anti-empiricist can perfectly well adopt the phenomenal theory.
That mass and gravity analogy completely clears it up. So, Lee has established his theory, shown its motivations, and proved it stands on its own 2 feet logically. But no good philosophy paper is complete without anticipating the heaviest attacks from opponents. Lee tackles 3 major objections sequentially, and we need to march through them in order. The first one is a direct attack on the zero thought experiment we just talked about. The objector says, wait a minute, if zero is necessarily stuck at a welfare level of zero forever, then zero doesn't actually have a welfare dimension at all. And if it has no welfare dimension, it can't be a welfare subject. How does Lee dismantle this objection?
The objector is essentially confusing having a score of 0 with not playing the game at all. Lee counters this by arguing that having a welfare level of 0 is a positive property. It is a specific location on a dimension, which is entirely different from lacking that dimension completely. He goes back to physics for another analogy. Think about an electron. It has a negative charge. A proton has a positive charge. A photon has exactly zero charge. But a photon still exists within the dimension of electromagnetism. Zero is its actual measurable charge property. Now compare that to the concept of love. Love doesn't have a positive charge, it doesn't have a negative charge, and it doesn't have a zero charge. Love entirely lacks the dimension of electrical charge. It's a category mistake to even ask. Lee argues that the entity zero is like the photon. Because it is conscious, it is on the welfare scale, and its position happens to be exactly zero. A rock, on the other hand, is like the concept of love in this context. It completely lacks the dimension of welfare. So, being stuck at zero does not strip zero of its status as a welfare subject.
That is such a satisfying rebuttal. Zero is a data point, not an empty cell on the spreadsheet. Okay, let's move to the second objection, which I'll call the plant objection. Some philosophers argue that plants have welfare. They say a plant can flourish, it needs water, it can be harmed by toxins. If plants have welfare and plants aren't conscious, then the phenomenal theory is dead in the water. How does Lee handle the seemingly undeniable fact that biologists and even everyday people talk about what is good for a plant?
Lee handles this by pointing out the polysemy of the word welfare. Words can have multiple, subtly different meanings depending on the context. When a biologist talks about the welfare of a plant, they are usually talking about its biological functioning or teleological goal-directedness. But if you stretch the ethical concept of a welfare subject to include anything with biological functioning, you open a massive Pandora's box. Because if a plant counts, then logically, your liver counts as a welfare subject independent of you. A corporation, which has goals and can flourish or die, would count. A beehive as a collective would count. Lee argues that when we use the word welfare in the deep, normative, ethical sense, the sense that grounds moral status and demands our empathy, we are talking about something entirely different from just a system functioning well. The plant objection just conflates a biological sense of the word good for with the philosophical, ethical sense of welfare.
Right. Watering a thirsty plant is good for its biological mechanics, but giving pain relief to a dog is a fundamentally different category of moral action. That brings us to the third and final objection Lee addresses: the problem of posthumous harm. If being a welfare subject requires the capacity for consciousness, then a dead person has no capacity for consciousness. Therefore, a dead person is not a welfare subject. But many people strongly intuit that you can harm someone after they die, for example, by slandering their reputation or destroying their life's work. If you can harm the dead, but the dead aren't conscious, doesn't that break Lee's theory?
It looks like a strong objection, but Lee resolves it by looking closely at who is actually being harmed in these scenarios. When someone's reputation is destroyed after their death, who is the subject of that harm? Lee argues that the harm doesn't attach to the corpse, which is no longer conscious. Instead, the harm attaches to the past conscious self. When you slander a dead person, you are negatively affecting the narrative or the fulfilled desires of the person while they were alive and conscious. Alternatively, if we are talking about future harms, like leaving a toxic environment for the next generation, the harm applies to future people who will possess the capacity for consciousness. In every coherent case of harm, the anchor point is always a conscious entity, whether that entity existed in the past or will exist in the future. The dead body itself, lacking the capacity for consciousness, is not the welfare subject. So the phenomenal theory survives the posthumous harm objection perfectly intact.
That makes perfect sense. The ethical violation is an arrow shot at a target that existed in the past, not at the dirt in the ground today. So we have traversed the entire dialectical cascade. We've seen the problem setting, the core claim, the intuitive and theoretical motivations, the proof of logical independence, and the defeat of three major objections. This brings us to how Lee ultimately frames his conclusion. Sometimes in philosophy, an author will drop the mic and claim they have solved the universe. But Lee doesn't do that here, does he? How strong is his actual conclusion regarding the phenomenal theory?
You are exactly right. He does not claim to have formulated a theory of everything. His conclusion is remarkably prudent but firmly positive. He doesn't claim that consciousness is what makes absolutely everything matter in every conceivable way, nor does he claim he has mathematically proven that consciousness is necessary and sufficient for all types of moral status. But he also doesn't retreat to saying it's just an open question where we need more research. What he explicitly argues is that the phenomenal theory should be seen as an essential ingredient in an ethics of consciousness. He has shown that it is a highly reasonable theory. It explains our deepest ethical intuitions. It has robust theoretical utility, and it systematically withstands the strongest philosophical objections thrown at it. Because of this, he believes it shouldn't just be a passing thought. It should be adopted as a fundamental building block when we construct any serious theory of welfare.
An essential ingredient in an ethics of consciousness. That is a perfectly calibrated landing. It tells us that while consciousness might not be the only thing we ever talk about in ethics, any ethical theory that ignores the boundary of consciousness is fundamentally missing the bedrock of what it means to be a subject. It's like trying to bake a cake without flour. Thank you for walking through this complex but incredibly rewarding paper with me. It really changes how you look at the world, from the toaster on your counter to the dog sleeping on the rug. We will leave our listeners to ponder just how much their own capacity for consciousness is the very thing that makes their lives matter.